Greetings! I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build this opel blitz or Maultier kit. This is a 28mm or 156 scale plastic model from Warlord Games. This kit can be used to build either the wheeled version of the opel blitz or the half-tracked version known as the Maultier. On the back of the box we find images of painted examples of the blitz built in both wheeled and tracked varieties in a few different paint schemes. It also shows the included infantry passengers, the detailed driver, and the decals, stat cards, and mostly obscured damage markers. There is also a couple of paragraphs of information about the vehicle. The kit comes on 3 sprues moulded in grey, 2 for the truck itself and 1 for the passengers. I rather like how these look. Everything on these sprues is really neat and crisp. That isn't really a shock though with these recent kits from Warlord. The main disappointment for me though, which at this stage isn't really shocking either, is that the sprues have no markings on them. You have to consult the sprue diagram in the instructions if you need a part number. It's a minor complaint to be sure, but it is a little bit annoying. There are of course a couple of mould lines, and as always some spots are worse than others, but for the most part these are barely visible and will be easy enough to clean up. I was unable to detect any defects by looking at these sprues, and I didn't encounter any during the build. The detailing here is quite good. There's a good amount of little bits and pieces that will be fun to pick out when the model is painted. This is of course a gaming piece, and it's in a relatively small scale, so there are going to be some simplifications and omissions in detail. It's particularly noticeable in areas like the tracks, which are a single piece. The average gamer isn't going to want to glue a bunch of tiny track links on, for example. I find myself saying this kind of thing a lot. There's always somebody who expects the same detail that you would see on a 1/16th scale model in 156 scale. With that in mind, the details are still quite good. I'm not planning on using them in this build, but I do rather like the infantry sprues that are included. There are quite a few guns and different heads and stuff that you can use for variety here. More than you need. Even if like me you aren't going to use this sprue on this model, this is still a very handy thing to have in your bits box. This little baggie contains all of the other bits and pieces, most of which aren't really surprising, like the damage marker kit. This acetate sheet though did kind of surprise me. It's intended to make window glazings, obviously. I do like that they have the shape of the windows marked out so that you don't have to guess when cutting out your windows. Very thoughtful. Then there are of course decals. There's a good variety of markings here, including Red Cross markings and a bunch of license plates. The decals that come in these kits are usually quite good and haven't given me any issues in the past. Here we see the stat cards, which are very stat cardy. There is one for both the wheeled and tracked version of the blitz. They obviously have slightly different stats. And of course the instructions. Teller of how to do things. These are quite good. In the front we have info about the decals and sprue guides, though I would prefer to have numbers on the sprues themselves, and of course there are some, for the most part, easy to understand and follow exploded diagrams that will tell us which bit to glue to what other bit. They're pretty clear in pointing out which of the steps are for which version of the blitz, which is of course helpful. In the back there are a few simple suggestions for how to paint the model. These are very basic, but they could give you something to start with. Before the model can be painted though, it has to be built, so let's do that. I start by gluing this framey bit into the top of the cab floor part. There are some fairly obvious pins that will help guide the positioning of this. I add some pressure and a little bit of extra glue and it should stay there pretty nicely. Or else. I put this aside to set, and then I glue the steering wheel into the dashboardy bit. There is a little bit of play in this, so I just nudge it to where I think it looked right. If you intend to build this with a driver, you wouldn't do this. You would use the steering wheel moulded into the driver's hands. My truck, however, will be driverless. They must have some cool technology. I then install the cab's rear wall. This is easy enough. It's sort of keyed to lock into these handy-dandy chair holders, I guess they might be called. Point is, this is very easy to put on nice and straight. Then I install the seat. This also goes in easily. But I couldn't get my fingers in there to nudge it around, so I used my knife. The result is pretty neat. It's not an overly fancy set of seats, but it does the job. I then test fit the roof and forgot to video myself gluing it, but it fits pretty well. as do the sides of the engine compartment. I make sure there's plenty of glue, then I put the part in place. To be sure it's on properly, I use the radiator grille as a kind of guide. If it looks neat enough, then it's on properly enough. I repeat the process with the left side of the engine compartment. This is a bit more work than if the cab were moulded in one piece, but it isn't too hard, and if you're careful in putting it together it will look just as good. It makes sense to then add the radiator grille. This goes onto the front of the engine compartment, which is no big surprise. The fit is rather good, and so far the entire cab is looking pretty nice. Very truck. It is missing doors though, so let's sort that out. These doors fit okay, though I feel like the gap around them was a little bit too big, and I did have to give them a fair bit of nudging before they would sit where I wanted them. These could easily be modelled open if you're into that sort of thing. It's good to have choices. It's then time to glue the cab assembly onto the frame. Unsurprisingly, this is easy. The parts more or less just slot together perfectly. I apply a bit of pressure anyway because that's just what I do, and I wanted to make sure there were no inappropriate gaps. Next comes the axle-y suspension-y part. This very easily mounts into the 4 holes on the bottom of the frame. I'm not sure if it matters which way around this goes. The part is simple, but it does the trick. You weren't expecting a fully detailed suspension and steering system, were you? That would be silly. And now, wheels, why not? These wheels are completely round with no keying, which is a bit unusual. Quite often, a model like this will have a slightly flattened spot on the wheel to give the appearance of the vehicle having some weight to it. Oh well, what matters is the wheels go on easily. The fit is a little bit tight, but not too tight. That's kind of helpful anyway, it makes it easier to get them on nice and straight. Then I glue in the framey, supporty thing for the tracks. Obviously if you're building the wheeled version you would be doing different things here. I'm sure those things are also pretty easy, like this. It pretty much just drops right into place. Then we can add the track sets. These are nice one-piece parts. There was one issue here. The thicker axle part at the front doesn't fit very well. The front of the track sets were sitting too far out to the sides, which doesn't look very good. My solution was to pry the tracks back off and trim down the axles. This is of course kind of annoying, but not too hard to do. The tracks did end up looking okay. There is still a bit of a mould line, and some of the parts where I cut them from the sprues do look a bit rough, but that can always be cleaned up a bit more later, or hidden with mud. Next comes this rectangular block with holes, which is the technical term. This is a support for the cargo compartment, and it is very simple to position. Then we might as well put the cargo compartment together, or passenger compartment, same thing, kinda. If you plan to use the canvas cover for this, you are supposed to use the high sides, as I've done. This is really quite simple to put together. It's really just building a box. These parts do have notches in their edges that help everything line up nice and neat. I quite appreciate that. It may be just a box, but that does make it a lot easier. I used the canvas cover part to check that the front and side parts were all straight and that it would fit together properly, and it looks like the test was a success. I finished the box off with the rear part, the tailgate. You could probably install this part in the open position if you wanted to. Clearly, I haven't. Gluing the cargo compartment to the rest of the truck seems like a good thing to do next. So I do that. There are a bunch of contact points to add glue to. Then I apply some pressure to make sure everything's together. Simple enough. I then add the towing hook thing. This has some keying, and it should drop down across some of the frame bars. This was kind of fiddly to get into place with the cargo compartment installed. It would have been a good idea to install this before the cargo compartment. Oh well, hindsight is 20/20. Knowing this can't help me now, but maybe it could help you. Next, a little stowage box goes on both sides, just above the last road wheel. It took me a bit longer than I would like to admit to figure out where these should go. Then I glue this little sign to the roof of the cab. I believe this is to indicate that the vehicle is towing something. Clearly it isn't, but it could be, and I thought the sign looked a bit more interesting in the up position than down. Then, because it's hard to see at night, I add these headlamps. I've chosen the covered sneaky convoy ones, but there is a pair of uncovered lamps you could use if you would prefer. These took a bit of nudging to get into place, but not too much. They look very lamp. Next, I install this shovel. This is an optional part. There's also a pickaxe you could install too, but I chose to leave that off. Perhaps the driver used it and then left it behind somewhere or something like that. He's going to be in trouble. Because this is optional, there's no mounting hole here, so you have to kind of eyeball it. And it was kind of fiddly, but I did eventually get it where I wanted it. I then glued the rear portion of the canvas covering in place. Was it canvas? Am I just assuming here? It's a material of some sort anyway. Probably canvas. Rambling aside, this part goes into place easily. There is a minimal gap around the joint, but it's not too bad and could easily be filled. There is a choice of open or closed rear parts for this, and I figured open looked a bit more interesting. I'm thinking of making a load of barrels and boxes or something to put in there. I test fit to make sure the cover will go into place properly, and it does. I've not applied any glue because I think it'll be better to leave this off until after painting, and if I do decide to put a load of some sort in there, the canvas top would make it really hard if it was glued in place. At any rate, that's the 28mm scale plastic Maultier by Warlord completed. It's been a while since I did a little comparison, so let's have a look at this model next to Rubicon's Maultier. If you couldn't tell, the Rubicon model is in the darker grey plastic, and as you can see, I've given it a different style cargo compartment, and it has a little roof rack for jerry cans and the spare tyre, which I thought was a cool feature. You probably noticed it right away. The Rubicon Maultier is smaller than the Warlord one. It's not a huge difference in size, but it's definitely noticeable. I'm not especially bothered by it, and I would still field these next to each other, but I'm sure it would upset some. The cab on the Rubicon model is slightly different to Warlord's, and it kind of makes me wonder if maybe they're based on different trucks, or different year models of the same kind of truck? I don't know, just kind of pondering really. The differences in cab shape don't really matter a whole lot to me, though it probably does to some. The hinge detailing on the cargo compartment of the Rubicon model looks a bit more detailed and interesting than on the Warlord kit, though I kind of like how the running gear of the tracks looks a bit more on the Warlord Maultier. In the end though, I think they're both very good looking models. They're different to each other in a bunch of ways, but they are still quite similar. I'm not going to tell you which one to buy, I don't care which one you choose really, but I figured it's nice to look at both, and if you are in the market for a Maultier, you can see them side by side and make your own choices. I'm pretty happy with the way this vehicle has turned out. It's quite Maultiery, and I think Maultiers look way more interesting than the regular old wheelie blitz. I guess there's just something interesting and cool about tracks, at least in my opinion. I'm sure this is a very useful vehicle if you've got shooty-mans that are too lazy to walk and need to be driven around in your games of bolt action. According to the stat cards, this thing can carry 12 men. Seems reasonable enough. I think the detailing on this Maultier is pretty decent. It is simplified in areas, and you would never call it extremely detailed, but it is still pretty good looking. There's a lot of little bits and pieces that you could pick out when painting the model, which is always nice. I'm no truck expert, I'm no expert in anything really, but I feel like this is a very good representation of the Blitz Maultier. You should have no problem at all determining what this is when you see it on the gaming table. I obviously didn't include them all, but I do like that there were a few options for additional details on this Maultier. Things like the shovel and pickaxe, crew and passengers, and different options for the lights. Like I said before, choices are nice to have. The model was very easy to put together. It did have its challenges and some minor frustrations, like the tracks not sitting properly, but that was easily overcome. There were very few parts that didn't go together nicely. Of course, it is a wargaming kit, so it is designed to be fairly easily built. Speaking of building, I built this model live on stream. It was a while ago, but I do remember it being a good time. So if you want to watch me build models live on stream, there's a link to my Twitch channel in the description below. I stream model building on Wednesday nights and Sunday mornings, local time of course, so give me a follow and check my schedule for further information. I would love to see you in chat. Shameless self-promotion time is now over. What do you think of this Maultier? Have you built this kit before? Did you build it as a tracked or wheeled version? Do you prefer the Rubicon version or the Warlord version? Or are you indifferent? Tell me your thoughts in the comments section below. Also, don't forget to subscribe, follow, ring the bell, and all the other things you do on YouTube and social media. Links to everything including Patreon and my Twitch channel are in the description below. You can also find the join button down there. And as always, I shall return soon, so until then, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.